It governs life and death. It can think and think about itself. It can control things far from itself. It orchestrates our thoughts, words, and deeds. And yet, it's fragile, vulnerable to accidents. When it functions normally, we hardly notice it. If problems occur, the outward signs are often startling. We refer to it as a single, a double, or a triple organ. This is the brain, the most mysterious organ in the living world. The brain combines and integrates information it receives both from within itself and from the outside. The brain itself neither hears nor sees, tastes nor touches, it feels nothing. Enclosed in the cranial chamber, it relies on sense organs to maintain permanent contact with the external world. In man, the sense of smell is secondary to sight and hearing, which monopolize a very large proportion of cerebral activity. The skull is a case comprised of 39 bones. Of these, 8 protect the brain against physical shocks. 3 envelopes, the meninges, serve as a cushion between the hard cranial wall and the cerebral tissue. The adult human brain weighs about 1,500 grams. Its wrinkled surface gives the appearance of a walnut. Anatomical convention breaks the brain down into 4 main regions. The frontal lobe behind the forehead. The occipital lobe situated beneath the occiput at the back of the head. The temporal lobe at the level of the temple. And the parietal lobe, which corresponds to the middle section of the brain. From its position at the top of the spinal column, the brain controls all parts of the body by means of a system of nerves that connects it to the muscles and the various organs. The 12 pairs of cranial nerves innervate the sense organs and the muscles of the face and head. The 10th pair, the vagus or pneumogastric nerve, also innervates the heart, stomach, and intestine. Any cerebral disorder has immediate repercussions within the organism. This zodiac man, subject to all the celestial influences, was the Middle Ages' attempt to explain the mysteries of the body. Without the insights gained from dissection of the human body, antiquity in the Middle Ages attributed to the brain such diverse functions as locomotion and the cooling of the humors. Contemporary treatises by military surgeons offered a more detailed description of the brain, but never challenged the medieval conception of its functions. It wasn't until the Renaissance that fresh interpretations were forthcoming. Vesalius's dissections and precise anatomical drawings deepened our knowledge of the brain and its different parts. Nonetheless, errors still persisted. René Descartes, whose skull is shown here, maintained that the minuscule epiphysis, which he called the pineal gland, was the seat of the human soul. In the 19th century, the most celebrated theory of cerebral function was that of Franz Joseph Gall. Although his hypothesis on cranial bumps has long fallen out of favor, it did have the merit of conceiving the brain not as a single organ, but as a group of functioning modules.
Of course, there was certainly enough neurological knowledge to point this way well before Gall. Since the ancient Egyptians, knowledge has been available that would have allowed us to deduce that the brain doesn't function as a homogeneous organ. It was known, for example, as the Edwin Smith papyrus shows, that lesions on the left side of the brain cause paralysis on the right side of the body, and lesions on the right side of the brain cause paralysis on the left side of the body. So enough was already known to be able to conclude that motor control of the body's right side originated in the left hemisphere of the brain. In other words, that there were crossed lanes, motor control lanes crossing over from the hemisphere on one side to innervate the opposite side of the body.
The cerebral mass is not completely solid. Cinemorphology is a film technique that allows us to observe successive layers of the brain from top to bottom, exposing its internal cavities. These are called ventricles and are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Examining the brain under a microscope reveals an incredible profusion of specialized cells known as neurons. It is estimated that the human brain contains up to 12 billion neurons. The neuron's function is to transmit information, and their anatomical structure is adapted to this purpose. Each neuron is comprised of a cellular body and extensions. The short extensions are called dendrites, and the long extensions axons. It is the axons that connect the nerve cells to one another, forming a complex communication system. Each neuron is the site of an intense electrical and chemical activity. The membrane surrounding the neurons permits rapid modification of the electrical potential and chemical exchanges. The nerve impulse is propelled along the length of the axon. A swelling at the tip of the axon at the synapse allows almost direct contact with the neighboring neuron. It's here in the synapse that the nerve impulse releases chemical substances into the synaptic button. The substances are called neurotransmitters, and they cross the narrow synaptic space to trigger a fresh nerve impulse in the neighboring neuron. The number of correlations possible among neurons is so great that to a large extent the human brain is not limited by genetic determinism. This is why it is not simply a slave to heredity. It demonstrates a flexibility that explains its powers of learning, adaptation, and creation. Thus, the brain, seen here from bottom to top, is the most complex and most fascinating of all the organs to chart and explore. As we have seen, the transmission of the nerve impulse is made possible by a change in the neuron's electrical potential. This potential can be measured with the aid of an instrument called an electroencephalograph. Electrodes positioned on the subject's scalp detect and record cerebral activity from a large number of discharging neurons. Regular activity continues during a state of calm or of sleep. In the case of complex muscular movement, the recording shows the areas of greater activity. In the case of a pianist, for example, coordination required by the hands means increased activity in particular parts of the brain, which in turn can be represented in graph form by waves of larger amplitude.
The two cerebral hemispheres are connected to each other by a powerful network of axons, or fibers, that allow an exchange of information between the two hemispheres in such a way that normally the left and right halves of the brain function together. When an individual's hemispheres are separated, what we call the split brain, as the result of sectioning of the corpus callosum, we observe that the left hemisphere is unaware of certain information directed to the right hemisphere. The study of such cases, we've been looking at the problem for some time, has advanced our understanding of the left and right hemispheres in humans. I think if I had to characterize these differences, I'd say that in a typical individual, the left hemisphere is the analytic and sequential hemisphere, while the right hemisphere is holistic. The way it functions is much more global, particularly, of course, in the area of perception.
To recognize the faces of these famous people, a right-handed person uses the right hemisphere of the brain. To name them, the left hemisphere. The history of our brain begins with the emergence of the first vertebrates about 600 million years ago. It was then that the central nervous system developed within the bony tube of the spinal column, which extends from the neck to the coccyx. The brain itself, protected by its cranial casing, gradually took up its position at the top of the spine. About 225 million years ago, the first great lizards and primeval reptiles made their appearance. Their cerebral makeup governed their most vital functions: the cardiovascular system, coordination of the reflexes and voluntary movements, the cycle of waking and sleeping, satisfaction of hunger and thirst, and the regulation of the reproductive system. The reptilian brain is the most ancient of the human brain's components and is comprised of the basal ganglia, the hypothalamus, the brainstem, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum. Later, a rudimentary cortex known as the limbic system appeared at the level of the corpus callosum and the hippocampus. The final evolutionary development was the neocortex, the uttermost portion of the brain. Computer analysis of fine slices of cerebral tissue allows us to simulate a three-dimensional view of the various parts of the brain we have been describing. Here we're using the Triune model of the brain as proposed by Maclean. In yellow, we see the different parts of the primitive reptilian brain. The limbic system is represented in red. In green, the neocortex forms an envelope surrounding the more primitive structures. According to Maclean's theory, our brain is the synthesis of these three brains. It is heir to a long evolution that has brought its three component parts into juxtaposition, while allowing them to retain their original functions. One of the oldest surviving members of the lizard family, the Komodo dragon, serves as a vivid illustration of the limits and possibilities of our reptilian brain. Primitive cerebral life was possible within a defined territory where a species could hunt, feed, develop reflexes, and reproduce. All life is made up of cycles of learning and ritual. The cycles of hunger and thirst are as basic to life as those of breathing, blood pressure, and sleep. An animal must feed. Whether the food is acquired through hunting or gathering, it is a question of survival, as much for humans as for animals.
Next week they're going to Bermuda.
In our case, we have ritualized this primordial activity considerably.
Oh, I'd love to fly somewhere nice for a second honeymoon.
Among the most primitive instincts is that of territorial possession, the need for a living space. Like animals, the human being learns to stake out his territory to warn off intruders. The markers used will be recognized by another member of the same species. In man, these markers are mostly visual. In animals, they are mainly olfactory. The invasion of a territory can provoke aggression. This aggression is expressed by an established set of precise rituals, demonstrations of strength intended to impress the adversary. This display ends in flight or combat.
I can't take it, I can't take it, I can't take it, I can't take it. I can't take it.
Combat itself is highly ritualized. The weapon may be a fist, a beak, or a claw, but the struggle's objective will be the same: the neutralization of the adversary, his flight or death. The automatic attack on vulnerable areas, the flank, the neck, and the head, reveal just how instinctive these aggressive confrontations are. The recognition of the dominant by the dominated serves to perpetuate hierarchies that exist in the human as well as the animal world. These hierarchies may be economic, social, cultural, or political. Domestic animals provide a good example of the submission of one species to another. Reproduction, too, is a primitive instinct. The origin of all amorous behavior can be traced back to a drive triggered within the hypothalamus. Freud called this drive the libido, and it exists in both animals and humans. Humans, however, can escape the routine nature of the sex act by their imagination and their culture. The advent of the mammals some 200 million years ago introduced a revolutionary change. Their young were not born in eggs. They were carried by the mother with whom they developed an affective bond, unknown till then. Humans, the most recent mammals, are well aware of the importance of this bond to their survival. Their young are born weak and remain so for a long time. Structurally, the brain developed a rudimentary cortex called the limbic system. Here are centered the emotions, memory, and the bond uniting parent and child. Animals experimentally deprived of their limbic system no longer recognize their offspring. Similarly, an injury to the limbic system can wipe out the capacity for play. In its normal day-to-day functioning, the brain as a whole, represented in blue, must integrate the functions of the limbic system in red with those of the reptilian complex in yellow. Driving a car is an excellent example of the integration of cerebral activity. It requires the analysis of information received from within and without, the ability to judge space, speed, and distance, the ability to interpret signals in order to obey some and ignore others. Above all, it requires the organization of these hundreds of messages into one activity that can be performed almost automatically. The greater development of the neocortex in man opened the way for the emergence of thought and creativity. Humans have transformed the world with their triune brain. As a result, they have come to give special importance to the neocortex, its most noble component, while sometimes overlooking the importance of the other two. Interpersonal communication takes place through words, gestures, and the perception of territories and hierarchies.
A double scotch, please.
Like that on the rocks or straight up?
On the rocks, I guess.
Yes, sir.
The power of speech is one of the most important human characteristics. Language zones are primarily located in the neocortex, but nevertheless depend on the limbic system. Emotion holds the tongue in check or loosens it.
Yes, of course I believe you. Where? That's near Maisonneuve and Crescent. Sure, I can be there in half an hour. Why not? No, that'll be no problem, really. No, I'll be able to spot you, sure. Okay, goodbye.
Speech involves significant intellectual and emotional activity. Tell the truth or lie, either way, the quality of the voice is affected.
Hello, Claire. How are you? I'm going to be a little late again. I'm sorry, but just work I've got to finish. No, you better go ahead and eat supper. Okay, bye-bye now.
As with every other cerebral activity, the power of speech can be impaired by any disturbance at its source.
A lesion here, in the posterior part of the third convolution of the left frontal lobe, would result in a severe speech difficulty. Speech would be abnormal, halting, and could be agrammatical in talking, and yet comprehension would be normal, or almost normal. On the other hand, a lesion here, which destroyed the posterior part of the first temporal convolution in the left hemisphere, would cause serious impairment in the comprehension of oral language, and in some cases, of written language as well. And yet, language production would still be possible, although the language produced would be deviant.
57 years.
You're 57?
Yes, 57. That must be it.
How long have you been in the hospital?
I think I've been here for 50 dono. 50 dono. Last week, because this week is in the week.
Well, here you have two other examples. At the time that this recording was made, I had already grown my beard, and this lady called me Miss. Miss, Mr., and Mrs. all meant one and the same thing to her. Then, immediately afterwards, she told us that she had been there for 50 dono. Now, I can't even guess what word she was searching for. So in this case, I'd say it is a non-word, a neologism. And in that short extract, the principal linguistic characteristics of this condition are present: phonemic deviations, verbal deviations, and neologisms. Now listen to her speak, and you will hear several other examples of one or another of these various types of language deviation found in Wernicke's aphasia.
Oh, I was paid for the little Simplon here, and I stayed 15 days entirely in the low-key. Why, I don't know. For as into the case, I don't know.
Man has added the extraordinary power of the written word to that of the spoken word. Writing presupposes a harmonious mastery of the brain's three constituent parts. Motor coordination is required for the hand to trace the letters, and emotions shape the message that the intellect wants to convey. The same holds true for calligraphy or for the interpretation of music. The passion for chess isn't exclusively intellectual. Territorial and hierarchical instincts are brought into play as well, the full range of the reptilian brain. Through the centuries, technological progress has been mirrored in man's conception of the brain. In the 17th century, models of the brain were based on recently invented clockwork mechanisms. In the next century, the brain was seen as an automaton that controlled movement from a distance. Then the Industrial Revolution and the birth of the assembly line produced a model of the brain based on a hierarchy of functions with a chain of command centers. At the turn of this century, the invention of the telephone engendered a model that put the emphasis on communications and the relation between the neurons. More recently, the computer revolution has given birth to the image of the brain as a computer, with the accent on its powers of programming and perception. Other theories will come to light. The principal value of Paul Maclean's is that it gives us a better understanding of the brain. It sets out to make clearer the links between humans and animals, and thus places us back in the biological universe from which we came. But the most authentic model of the brain continues to be the brain itself, the timeless mirror of our never-ending attempts to understand it. Of the great brains that have illuminated the march of humanity, some were great warriors and some great thinkers. Some stood out for their determination and others for their charisma. Among them there are corticals, limbics, and reptilians, which is to say there are intellectual, emotional, and instinctive types. What they have in common is the exceptional influence they exerted, for better or worse, either in the spiritual or the material domain, because of the extraordinary nature of their brains. More than by ideas, the world is ruled by the brain.